What is a nuclear warhead? Weapon, power, leadership. Ultimately, it's all associated with nuclear weapons. In the 20th century, when the world was on the brink of discovering such weapons, nuclear weapons sparked interest and fear, but also opened up new possibilities. You might be surprised, but the nuclear bomb was invented with the aim of achieving peace. Everyone wanted to put an end to wars on the planet, and whoever had such a weapon in their hands could dictate the rules of the game and act as a guarantor of security. However, the situation got out of control and turned into a massive what is a nuclear warhead, weapon, power, leadership. In the end, it's all words associated with nuclear weapons today. Within the 20th century, when the world was just on the threshold of inventing such shells, nuclear weapons caused interest, fear, but also opened up new opportunities. You will probably be surprised, but the nuclear bomb was invented in order to achieve peace. Everyone wanted to put an end to wars on the planet, and whoever had such a weapon in their hands could dictate their own rules of the game and act as a guarantor of security. However, the situation got out of control and turned into a massive confrontation. In terms of the arms race, July 16, 1945, changed the world forever. It was the day when the USA tested the first atomic bomb in the world. It was called the Gadget, and the explosion that caused a 12-kilometer fiery mushroom was seen by people hundreds of kilometers away. On the one hand, this is a success. Why celebrate? America became the most powerful on the planet. On the other hand, the testing launched a chain of events that would lead to Hiroshima. The emergence of nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the destruction of nature, and the arms race that continues to this day are all associated with one person, an American physicist considered to be the father and founder of atomic weapons, named Robert Oppenheimer. The world will never be the same again after the explosion. Some people laughed, some people cried, and many stood still. At that moment, I remembered the lines from Hindu scripture, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Today, the possession of nuclear weapons guarantees a country a powerful position on the geopolitical map of the world. However, it does not guarantee prosperity. Take the example of the United States and Russia, who between them possess over 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. Moscow has even more warheads than Washington, and despite their strong political standing, their standard of living is still different. In this video, I will tell you about how nuclear weapons were created and how their owners turned into monsters of geopolitics. You will learn about the Manhattan Project and how tens of thousands of people worked on the creation of weapons of mass destruction. You will also learn how the United States turned a small coral island into a deserted wasteland with its testing. And what does SpongeBob cartoon have to do with it? How did the Soviet Union copy the American atomic bomb and who helped them? Why is the conspiracy theory about the existence of UFOs related to nuclear testing? And what will happen to the planet in the event of a nuclear war? The prehistory of the creation of the atomic bomb actually began quite innocently in 1938 when German physicists, one of whom you can see in the video, Otto Hahn, stated that the bombardment of uranium nuclei with neutrons could lead to the fission of the atom. This was a revolutionary statement and a hyper-important discovery because Einstein's equations and experiments predicted that the explosion would only come from one divided atom and would be an incredible force. Physicists all over the world understood that mastering this process and understanding its mechanisms would allow them to create the most powerful bomb on the planet. And this, I remind you, was happening during World War II when everyone knew that Hitler would not miss the chance to get such a weapon, so the United States decided to be the first to join this race. They started with spies who were sent to the ranks of the Nazis to track any attempts to create such a weapon. In addition, they also sent spies to the Soviet Union. At that time, any information about these developments was worth its weight in gold, and it was not surprising because having such an arsenal at hand, one could put the entire world on its knees. Despite the fact that intelligence agencies played an important role in monitoring the creation of such weapons, only intelligence was not enough. So planning began for the Manhattan Project, a massive program aimed at putting the United States in the first place in nuclear weapons development. It all began with a small group of Jewish refugees who fled from Germany. They stated that the Germans were already working on the development, despite the fact that all the knowledge, materials, and processes were well known to scientists. No one knew how to put everything together to make it work. It was like having Lego pieces without instructions. In 1941, the then President of the United States, Franklin, officially approved the country's atomic program for greater efficiency and decided to seek the support of allies Britain and Canada. Resources, people, and a place were needed to make everything successful. While there were no problems with the first 2 points, finding a location proved to be a challenge because the secret development had to be well disguised. In the case of the United States, Americans bought up farmland and built laboratory complexes there, sometimes displacing thousands of people without any arguments or explanations, as work on the new project was the #1 priority. Overall, there were at least 30 different locations in the 3 countries, each working on separate developments. Some worked on fuel, some on the casings for the future bombs, some extracted raw materials, some worked on electronics, and so on for all these processes. Roughly $2 billion was spent on the project, which by today's standards is a little over $20 billion. Why was the project named Manhattan? It's hard to say for sure, but researchers believe that it wasn't attention-grabbing and that the name was typical for the United States, where military bases and locations are often named after cities and regions. Despite the fact that the development of the atomic bomb was spread throughout the country, the Manhattan Project coordinated all the work. Therefore, depending on the region or state, names may differ, but the Manhattan name was used to coordinate all the work. Researchers say that the whole program was even named after Manhattan, and even though the coordination board will move to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the name will still remain. On December 28, 1942, President Roosevelt sanctioned the creation of the Manhattan Project with the aim of developing nuclear weapons. Research facilities were built in New Mexico, Tennessee, and Washington. The project was headed by Colonel Leslie Groves of the U.S. Army. However, there were many problems and disagreements between the countries involved in creating the weapons. Each participant wanted equal rights, but the Americans were not eager to share their secrets because their allies might become enemies in the future. The White House often criticized its allies for contributing too little money to the program, but they could not refuse to cooperate because they needed the best minds on the planet. After 11 months of disputes, a compromise was reached. The development of weapons would take place in the USA, but whether to use them or not would be a collective decision. All scientists, engineers, and researchers worked under the leadership of a man you already know, Robert Oppenheimer. Although he became the director of the Manhattan Project by chance, no one wanted to appoint him as the leader because of his ties to the communists. He had friends and relatives who sympathized with the Reds, but it was Leslie Groves who insisted on Oppenheimer's candidacy, and he was not mistaken. Within a few years, they together would create the world's first atomic bomb. But, of course, not without the help of Oppenheimer, who only provided the direction in which to move. The path to creation was difficult and incredibly long. Everything depended on uranium, and years were spent on its extraction, which in the long run allowed them to produce only 1 bomb a year. This could cause harm, but not lead to victory. Therefore, a person was needed who could speed up the process, and this person became an American of Ukrainian origin, George Kistiakowsky. At the beginning, the Presidential Committee of Scientific Consultants was led by James Killian, and after him, Kistiakowsky and Eisenhower. The latter respected Kistiakowsky and valued his ability to use scientific achievements for military purposes. Georgie's rich experience in working with explosive substances was very useful in Los Alamos, where the atomic bomb was being created. Kistiakowsky solved the uranium issue by conducting experiments with plutonium in the explosives department. He worked until the completion of the Manhattan Project, greatly simplifying the life of Oppenheimer. Thanks to the achievements and developments of the Ukrainian scientist, the laboratory complex for research turned into a whole death factory, which with each passing day brought the appearance of the atomic bomb closer. If we talk about the places where development was carried out, we will take the most popular object, Outreach in the state of Tennessee. It is a giant laboratory complex hidden in the forests, so small that it could be called a city, with a territory of 240 square kilometers. This is what it looks like now. The employees did not leave this complex. They were provided with all the conditions so that they did not have to. All the people who worked on the development were divided into different levels and ranks. I, at level 1, do not know what my colleagues from level 2 are working on. And so on. It was well thought out to avoid leaks of information. But whether it worked and helped to keep the development secret, I will tell you in the next issue. Even journalists followed the information silence. Once again, nobody wrote or tried to draw attention to the Manhattan Project. Everyone was well aware that the USSR was not sleeping and would use any opportunity to gain access to such information. There is even a belief that most Manhattan Project employees did not even suspect that they were developing atomic weapons. And throughout the country, except for intelligence and military leadership, only about 20 people knew about the creation of such weapons. But do you know how many people worked on this project? Approximately 128,000, although not all of them were scientists. This number includes cleaners, drivers, and support staff. However, they were all closely monitored. Almost 6,000 law enforcement and intelligence personnel were assigned to each worker. And in addition to the 128,000 people employed, there were also various job candidates, totaling 400,000 people and 600 companies. Intelligence agencies tried to monitor everyone, not to mention checkpoints, vehicle inspections, and total external control. You may remember that the American agency actively worked in Germany and the USSR to ensure that atomic weapons did not suddenly appear in the hands of competitors and enemies. Meanwhile, on July 16, 1945, the development of the world's first atomic bomb was completed and it was time to test it. The bomb, with a power of 25 kilotons, was named Gadget, and the Trinity test took place at 5:29 a.m. The bomb created a crater with a radius of 300 meters, and the sand around the explosion turned into green crystals later named trinitite. The explosion was so loud that it could be heard up to 200 kilometers away, and the mushroom cloud rose to a height of 12 kilometers. 475 people, including the main figure Robert Oppenheimer, witnessed the test and understood the consequences it would bring. Someone even asked me if it was possible to kill 40 million Americans in the 20 largest cities in the country with an atomic bomb, all in one night. On the one hand, the successful testing of atomic weapons was an incredible achievement after 5 years of titanic work by scientists who were able to create a weapon that the whole world had been dreaming of. On the other hand, this became the beginning of a new era in which in the future, this same invention could potentially kill us all. The inventors of the weapon were well aware that their development would have very significant consequences and that the stability of the world would depend on the political views, desires, and emotional state of specific individuals. The Japanese felt all these consequences themselves in August of 1945, almost a month after the testing in New Mexico. This was the only and, hopefully, the last case of using such a weapon against humanity. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki claimed at least 200,000 lives, and both cities were reduced to ruins. Not to mention the diseases that began to appear a few years after the mushroom cloud, and the people who survived became outcasts. They were feared, and it was believed that radiation was contagious. Their lives were shattered, and the war did not always end with receiving the third strike. No one wanted it, but the end of conventional confrontation marked the beginning of a new conflict and arms race, in which the services played a significant role. Before telling you about the race for the theft of nuclear secrets, there is another important detail: the testing of atomic weapons after the end of World War II, between 1946 and 1958 in the United States. They detonated 23 nuclear warheads on a small remote ring of islands that make up the atoll of Bikini. At that time, Washington was looking for a place to test and constantly improve its atomic developments, and the first place that came to mind was the Bikini Atoll. This is such a remote area that not even most Americans know where it is, with an area just over 3 square kilometers in the central part of the Pacific Ocean, an ideal place for testing. First, it was under U.S. control, far from shipping lanes, but within 1,500 kilometers of bases where nuclear bombers could take off. Second, the lagoon that surrounded the atoll was a convenient place to place ships as targets. Third, the population of Bikini at that time was only 167 people, and they could be resettled. Eventually, American generals made a deal with the locals for temporary resettlement, but at that time, they did not know how tragic the fate of their land would be. The small atoll will become one of the most famous places on the planet. However, it is unsuitable for life. The name Bikini will become so well known in the world that brands will not call their swimsuits after it out of good intentions, but out of a desire to create hype and to associate their swimsuits with the word explosion. The atomic weapons testing program is named Crossroads, and as part of these tests, in July 1946, they decided to experiment with destroying a fleet. They placed 95 ships in the lagoon, with laboratory animals such as goats, pigs, mice, rats, and so on. At 9 a.m., a B-29 bomber took off from the base and dropped an atomic bomb, which exploded at a height of 158 meters above the surface of the water. The pilot missed slightly, and only the ships were flooded, but the force of the explosion and the radiation killed a third of the total number of laboratory animals that were on board. 24 days later, in the same year of 1946, they decided to conduct the first underwater nuclear weapon test at a depth of 27 meters. The explosion created a giant bubble of hot gas, which simultaneously expanded downwards and upwards from the explosion. A crater with a depth of 9 meters and a width of 609 meters was formed on the seabed, and a giant water dome about 1.5 kilometers high was formed on the surface. A 28-meter wave moved with such force and speed that it was able to lift and sink the USS Arkansas, which weighed almost 27,000 tons and was 171 meters long. In addition, the ships that were nearby were covered in radioactivity like targets. In March 1954, they conducted the first test of a thermonuclear weapon, which was hard to call successful because the researchers miscalculated and underestimated the scale of destruction. As a result, the explosion was 3 times more powerful, and 3 islands of the atoll simply evaporated, and a crater with a width of over 1.5 kilometers was formed on the bottom of the lagoon. Radioactive waste thrown out as a result of an explosion, it spread over a distance of up to 120 kilometers and infected 23 members of the crew of a Japanese fishing boat. One of them died 6 months later, and an examination established that the cause of death was radiation sickness. In 1960, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission declared the Bikini Atoll a dangerous place to live due to radiation sickness. The residents were evacuated and promised to return, but instead, they were relocated to an island 700 kilometers away from their home. In 2010, UNESCO declared the Bikini Atoll a World Heritage Site as a reminder of the terrible power of nuclear weapons and their impact on modern civilization. There is a belief that Bikini Bottom, the town where SpongeBob SquarePants lives, is a prototype of an underwater atoll. Supposedly, everything under the water mutated and learned how to talk as a result of the radioactive explosions and waste. However, the events in the cartoon take place not in 1946, when the Operation Crossroads began, but from the birth of Neptune in 2010 until our era. And before we move on to the topic of nuclear secrets theft, the last thing about Atoll Bikini is the international observers. During one of their tests, the Americans allowed representatives of the USSR to attend, for unclear reasons, perhaps to demonstrate their power and declare their position. Regardless, Lavrentiy Beria sent his own people to the test. They watched, but the explosions did not impress them. Later, the Soviet newspaper Pravda wrote that these tests were nothing more than ordinary blackmail, and besides outdated military ships, the only thing they blew up was faith in the seriousness of American talks about nuclear weapons. However, the USSR understood well that they could not lose in this arms race, and they urgently needed their own nuclear weapons. Stalin was particularly interested in the appearance of such technology, and he instructed Beria to gather a team of scientists and present a development in the nearest future. This was in 1945, and scientists in the USSR were, of course, present, but they faced the same problem that their colleagues in the US had faced before: how to put everything together. Additionally, the Second World War had just ended, and the economy was devastated, so talking about technologies that could help create nuclear weapons was not possible at all. Then the chief developer of the Soviet atomic weapons was physicist Igor Kurchatov. He was the one who had to figure out how to transform uranium into plutonium. The KGB didn't ask him if he could do it or not. He had 2 options: either he would do it and become a hero of the Soviet Union, or he wouldn't do it and go on vacation in the nude. This was a great motivation for scientists at that time. Lavrentiy Beria himself understood perfectly well that without intelligence agencies and spies, it would be impossible to achieve this goal. And since he also had connections there, he turned to the agency for help. The easiest way to create their own atomic weapons was to steal the American analog. The Soviet version of the atomic bomb would become an exact copy of the Fat Man bomb dropped by the US on Nagasaki, although Moscow propaganda would present it as if the bomb was entirely of domestic production. The Manhattan Project is the only source of information in the world about the atomic bomb. American and British laboratories scattered throughout the US were precisely dealing with issues of uranium and plutonium. This is exactly what the Kremlin needed to create its own weapons. So the Moscow intelligence agencies planned to recruit someone who could not only provide them with specific data and blueprints, but also explain how everything works in the best traditions of the Soviet Union. The agents not only copied the bomb itself, but practically the entire layout of the laboratory complex, including construction technologies and even components for future weapons. Top Soviet scientists who worked on the project were even prohibited from traveling independently in the presence of Chekists. So, the secrets of the bomb or components were able to be used thanks to the recruitment of 4 foreigners, starting with the first 2, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They, according to the subsequent investigation, worked as couriers who carried documents from the laboratories and passed them on to Kremlin curators. As a result, both were executed for treason on the electric chair on June 19, 1953. Julius died after the first shock of electricity, while Ethel's execution did not go as smoothly. After 3 shocks, she was still alive, so when they struck her for the 5th time, witnesses reported that smoke came out of her head. If everything was clear about Julius and he was exposed as part of the program to spy for the Soviet Union, nothing is known to this day about Ethel. In court, she admitted that she was a member of the Communist Party of the USA, but she never confessed to spying for the USSR. Therefore, the case of her execution remains controversial to this day. After all, even in the USSR, it was not recognized that Ethel was spying for them, but historians agree on one thing: the execution of both was an attempt by American intelligence to cover up their own shortcomings and mistakes, and somehow justify the fact that the USSR had its own atomic weapons, because both Julius and Ethel were accused in court of passing drawings that helped the Kremlin, finally, to create their own weapons of mass destruction. But in fact, neither Julius nor Ethel Rosenberg had access to such information, at least because they did not have the necessary education to understand drawings or explain anything to the Chekists. Therefore, they could not have had access to such information. It is possible that there were other people who helped them, but nothing is known about them, just like the legend of Agent Perseus, the hypothetical Soviet spy who helped the USSR gather data on the Manhattan Project, is still unknown. If we return to the Rosenbergs, the only thing they could have helped the communists with is organization. They could have told them how laboratories were arranged, what details were assembled and manufactured in different places. However, according to the engineers themselves, it is unlikely that anyone took the Rosenbergs' information seriously, if it even existed. As for who could have had access to such information, the 2 most important people in this story of theft are Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist who worked for the British, and Ursula Kosinski, also a German who worked for the Soviet Special Services under the code name Agent Sonia. Fuchs passed information to Ursula, and she was responsible for delivering these documents to the Kremlin. This tandem was called a golden find in the USSR, although their work, like a tent, was more of an unfinished job from American and British intelligence services than the merit of Soviet agents. The reason for this is that every employee was only allowed to work after being checked by the relevant authorities, so how a communist sympathizer like Fuchs ended up there is a question that has no answer. And of course, the Russians took advantage of this by sending the agent Sony to Fuchs, which gave the USSR all the necessary information regarding uranium and plutonium technology, reactor construction, and the design of future bombs. In February 1950, Fuchs was arrested by British intelligence services and sentenced to 14 years in prison. This was the maximum term that could be obtained for spying for a Soviet state, because Britain and the USSR were allies, and the US sought to execute Fuchs and demanded his deportation. But London refused, possibly because the USSR did not recognize Klaus Fuchs as their agent. In 1959, he was released from prison already deprived of British citizenship and moved to the GDR, where he taught at the university and lived until 1988. His wife said that Fuchs no longer expected anything from the Soviet authorities. As always, communism was everything, and even though Fuchs' contribution to the development of the Soviet atomic bomb was really important, the Kremlin actually managed without him. They could have created atomic weapons even without Fuchs, Sony, or the Rosenbergs. It would just have taken a little more time. Unfortunately, on August 9, 1949, they conducted their own successful tests at the range. They placed various objects, from military equipment to various fortifications, and also brought in 1,500 animals. It was interesting to see how the shock wave and radiation affected living organisms within a 5 kilometers radius of the explosion, and everything within that radius turned into ruins. The RDS-1 tests were a shock to the British and Americans. For example, the British thought the tests would not be carried out until 1954, while the Americans believed the explosion would not happen until 1953. It didn't make sense because the Second World War had ended and the economy and technology were in decline. Intelligence investigations showed that there were no hints of such weapons development, and then bam, successful tests. The then director of the CIA, Hillen, was almost fired for negligence. He personally convinced everyone that the tests would not be conducted until 1953, but he was eventually removed from his position in 1950. When the Korean War began, Hillen was convinced that there would be no war at all. He was a cool director, that's a fact. Speaking of the RDS-1 nuclear test, it is worth noting that the Soviet intelligence was able to obtain and conduct the test secretly. Despite the fact that the United States launched air balloons over the territory of the USSR to track vibrations from potential tests, the Soviet scientists were successful in their mission. These balloons, however, became the reason for the massive conspiracy theory about the existence of UFOs, as one of them fell in 1947 and the intelligence agencies had no better explanation than to claim it was debris from an alien spacecraft. It is possible that, at that time, this was the only rational decision, as the Kremlin would have known that they were being spied on. This incident became the beginning of discussions about the existence of UFOs, and I have previously discussed in the first video on this channel why the Americans attempted to conceal details about unidentified flying objects. Nuclear weapons were initially created as a means of achieving peace, but it quickly turned into an arms race. Every country wanted to have such systems to ensure their safety. However, the Cuban Missile Crisis showed that creating weapons for the sake of peace was a dead end from the very beginning, as atomic bombs are extremely dangerous. The world has reached the creation of rockets that can reach any point on the planet in a matter of minutes. As of today, there are 12,705 nuclear warheads in the world, almost 6,000 in Russia, 5.5 in the US, 350 in China, 290 in France, 225 in the UK, 165 in Pakistan, 160 in India, 90 in Israel, and 20 in North Korea. These are just official figures, and no one knows how many dictatorships may be hiding. Finally, a bit about what to expect from a nuclear explosion. The first and most important is direct radiation, the deadliest effect of a nuclear bomb's detonation. This radiation is formed as a result of nuclear reactions and is manifested in the form of gamma rays and neutrons. It lasts less than a second, but its radiation can spread for kilometers from the epicenter. Microseconds after the explosion, the energy released in the form of X-ray radiation begins to heat the environment so strongly that a fireball of overheated air is formed. The temperature is so extreme that all matter turns into hot plasma. For example, a fireball from an air bomb explosion with a power of 300 kilotons, which is equivalent to a W-87 thermonuclear warhead mounted on American missiles. Its diameter can be less than 3 meters and can grow to over 600 meters. The light from this ball will be so intense that it will ignite fires and cause first-degree burns at a distance of 13 kilometers. Then, a shockwave follows, accounting for about half of the bomb's explosive energy. Its destructive power depends on the explosive power of the warhead and the height of the detonation. But since we are already talking about a power of 300 kilotons, there will be no living space within a radius of 5 kilometers for the first 10 seconds after the detonation. However, the nuclear explosion will still release most of its energy in the form of heat and fireball radiation. The fireball begins to cool and rise, forming a nuclear mushroom cloud. Inside it are highly radioactive mixtures of split atoms. With time, they will begin to fall from the cloud, and those affected will receive lethal doses of ionizing radiation. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission says that such a mushroom cloud could cover an area of thousands of square kilometers. Everything depends on weather conditions, but it's best to wait at least 48 hours and not go outside alone. The explosion of a modern nuclear warhead with a capacity of 300 KT is 10 times more powerful than the warheads used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. In a place like New York, such an explosion could lead to the death of over 1 million people in the first 24 hours after detonation. If we talk about nuclear war, a regional confrontation between India and Pakistan, if they use only 15 KT warheads, would lead to 27 million deaths. A global nuclear war between the US and Russia, assuming they use 4,000 warheads with a capacity of 100 KT, would lead to 360 million deaths. By the way, this estimate is based on a scenario of full-scale nuclear war, only assuming that both sides adhere to the Strategic Offensive Arms Reduction Treaty of 2022. But we all know that Russia has suspended its participation in a total nuclear war between Russia and the United States. Two countries will not be limited to a certain number of shelling only on each other's territory, but on targets. They can also send some of their weapons to other countries, including those that have nuclear weapons, and these states may launch some or all of their weapons in response. It is difficult to estimate how many casualties there will be in such a case, but the deaths of hundreds of millions will only be the beginning of a catastrophe that will engulf the entire world. Another important factor is hunger, which will be so severe 2 years after a small or large nuclear war that, coupled with other problems such as climate change, diseases, and technological decline, it will take more than half of the world's population. Einstein said that atomic weapons will change absolutely everything except one way of our thinking. Humanity never realized that it created a weapon capable of destroying all of us. Thank you for watching this video until the end. Give it a thumbs up or thumbs down, comment, share this video, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to help it grow.